Okay, I'm fine.
Okay.
Okay, Paul.
I start? Okay. Alice Rothchild is a recently retired obstetrician-gynecologist. She is also a writer, filmmaker, and activist who has spent decades working for Palestinian rights and for women's rights. She is the author of 4 books: Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, Stories of Jewish and Palestinian Trauma and Resilience. Second book is On the Brink, Israel and Palestine on the Eve of the 2014 Gaza Invasion. Third book, Condition Critical, Life and Death in Israel-Palestine. And her first young adult novel, Finding Melody Sullivan, published just recently. Before moving to Seattle, Alice expanded on the moral command in the Hebrew Bible's Exodus 22, lines 20 through 22, which states, "You shall not wrong or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Alice regularly helped 4 strangers, Palestinian medical students, every year for a while, by finding 6-month positions for them at Beth Israel, MGH, and other large Boston hospitals, and having all 4 reside with her and her family in their Brookline home. That's a lot more than Exodus 22. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who's here. We just got another person. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to start out with a land acknowledgement. I don't know if you folks tend to do that, but I think it's a good way to start a conversation. And also because one of the underlying themes of this conversation involves Indigenous peoples and settler colonialism, it's important to us to take a moment to reflect on ourselves. So since I'm in Seattle, I'm going to acknowledge the Duwamish people. They were the indigenous people of modern Seattle, of the metropolitan Seattle. They've lived in this region for 10,000 years. And there were 13 prominent villages in what is now the city of Seattle. And the people who live around Lake Washington, where I live, were called the Hachuabash, the people of the large lake. And I think we need to remember that we're not just saying their names, but we're acknowledging that this is where they lived and died, hunted, planted, had their children, loved, grieved, and told their stories. So now, you can think of whatever Indigenous peoples are around wherever you are living. So I'm going to now turn to the topic of interest. And the first thing I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what's going on between Israel and U.S. Jews. And there's so much going on right now in the news. We can certainly talk more about that at the end. But just for some historical background, U.S. Jews became increasingly secular after World War II. And what happened was that increasingly loving Israel and supporting Israel as a precious miracle rising up out of the ashes of the Holocaust was part of being Jewish. So as one leader once told me, Israel is the religion. To be Jewish is to love Israel and to support Israel. And this became even more prominent after the 1967 war. So for decades, U.S. Jews who have been predominantly liberal and Zionist have believed that the 67 occupation is temporary, that peace is right around the corner, that Israel is this spunky, young, evolving democracy, with a few warts, but, it's young, give it a chance to develop. And so what has happened recently is that Israel's new radically right government has not created a new reality, but rather made it impossible to deny the reality that has existed for decades. So U.S. Jews, again, mostly liberal-minded, are facing giving up some major mythology in the face of what's going on. One of the things is they have to understand that the occupation is not temporary. If you look at, for instance, the separation wall, which is this big concrete wall in many places, other places, a highly militarized wire fence, it's twice as long as the armistice line that was created in 1948. So this is not something that's going away. By the end of the building of the wall, which is pretty close, almost half of the West Bank will be annexed to Israel. And current leaders are talking about annexing even more. And Palestinian communities are being isolated into these little Bantustans and ghettos and military zones. And so the vast majority of Palestinians living in the West Bank will have their villages and homes surrounded by walls, settlements, and settler-only roads. So it's become clearer and clearer to people, despite the attempts to deny this, that this is not a temporary solution. And then, in fact, the two-state solution, whether it was ever a thing that could happen or not, is clearly quite dead on arrival. The other thing that US Jews are having to give up is the idea that Israel is this wonderful haven for LGBTQI folks, frolicking on a Tel Aviv beach with a gorgeous soldier. But the rising power of the ultra-Orthodox rabbis and the latest batch of government leaders are clearly very homophobic and against LGBTQI folks. Another myth is that Israel is a home for all Jews. Again, the rising power of the ultra-Orthodox shows that the rabbis have huge power in defining who is a Jew, and they're very hostile to anyone who's not Orthodox. And in fact, many more secular Israelis, bop off to Cyprus to get married because they can't stand all the religion that would have to go into making their marriages valid in Israel. The other thing that's really coming to fore is the idea that Israel is a democracy. People are beginning to face the fact that it doesn't have a constitution, because a constitution requires that you then give equal rights to all your citizens. And the reality is that what's happened is a legalization of Jewish supremacy with a bill called the Nation State Bill that was passed in 2018, which really codified legally a system of severe segregation, separation, and domination. So clearly, the Israeli government chose Jewish over democracy. And also the newest government is a coalition of the most right-wing religious and nationalist extremists we've ever seen, that many people are describing as fascists. So they're a hard bunch to love. And then there's the background in which all this is happening. There's growing international concern for Palestinian rights. They're using the language that many liberal Zionists support, and support for any other country or minority group, but not for Palestinians. Youth are becoming much more supportive of Palestinian struggle, and the struggle for justice for Palestinians is now a major international social justice issue, with a lot of intersectional moments like Black Lives Matter supporting the struggle for Palestinian rights, fights against police brutality interlinking with Palestinian rights. And then we see the mainstreaming of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement internationally. There's also, if you pay attention, an increasing level of violence against Palestinians and human rights activists. And I don't know if you noticed this, but last year, the Israeli government attacked 6 totally respectable human rights organizations in Israel and the West Bank and accused them of terrorism and basically tried to shut them down. And the terrorism that the Israelis are putting on the Palestinians is both military terrorism and settler attacks. So the risk of a large-scale violent confrontation is growing every day, and may be growing right now under our eyes. And also, for people that follow this, the Palestinian leadership is really bankrupt. The Palestinian Authority is basically a subcontractor for Israeli security. The PA spends more on security than education and health combined. Hamas and the PA continue their totally dysfunctional struggle for power. So younger Palestinians are totally fed up with this, and they're looking for new tactics and new leadership and breaking out of old political silos. And so there's increasing support for one democratic state in Palestine. We also saw with Trump's Abraham Accords a kind of rearrangement of the Arabic world. And what we saw, the question was, how much do Arab regimes care about the fate of Palestinians, and how much can they be bought off with some official recognition and then a big buttload of promises of military equipment and support, which is what they got in exchange. And we also know that Netanyahu, who's the head of the government, always needs to have an enemy. And he's incredibly belligerent towards Iran, which keeps everybody kind of rallied. And now he's rattling the swords against Gaza. So it's getting harder and harder to support him. And then we have our president and Biden and the presidents before him, who are very committed to the old status quo. They see Netanyahu and his henchmen as kind of some weird quirk off the rails. And if we could only get back to the good old days, whereas many of us see what's going on now as the logical culmination of Zionism, which is really a code for Jewish supremacy. So when people stop and take a deep breath, they realize that functionally what there is a one state from the river to the sea, but it is an apartheid state. There's an aggressive occupation and siege in the occupied territories. There's much that has been annexed, and many in the US are fearing what's going to come next. And if you look at Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, that's 20% of Israel. They are functionally and legislatively second-class citizens when you look at their rights, land ownership, employment, which is often related to serving in the Israeli Defense Force. Their funding for schools, clinics is lower than Jewish towns. They live in very segregated towns and cities. Some are unable to live with their spouses who come from the West Bank and Gaza. There's no right of return. So in a country where only Jews have self-determination, there's now no pretense of equality. And this one state has gradations of privilege and marginalization, with Ashkenazi Jews, Jews from Eastern Europe on the top, and probably Palestinians that are beyond the territories at the bottom. There's also been an unmasking of this separation, this separateness, due to things like ethnicity and nationality and religion by the International Criminal Court that defined this as a legalized scheme of racial segregation and discrimination. And they actually went and said this is a crime against humanity. In addition, a number of prominent and respected human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and even B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization, and Al-Haq, which is a Palestinian one, and even the US Foreign Affairs magazine have called all of this apartheid, a regime of apartheid. So it's important to remember that no country in the world today is defined as a democratic state where the constitutional identity is determined by ethnic affiliation, and that overrides the principle of equal citizenship. And so many people who are anti-racist in all sorts of parts of their life find this extremely problematic. And this has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And all of this makes liberal Zionists very squirmy. So it's very difficult for liberal supporters of Israel to see Israel as Jewish and democratic. Now, obviously, mainstream Jewish organizations are lining up, loyal, and will stand with Israel no matter what. But there's even a fraying at that level. A couple of weeks ago, there was a meeting of the Jewish Federation from the US in Israel, and attendees to the conference actually left the conference to go out and march with the protesters who were protesting Netanyahu. This has never happened before. And also more Jewish Americans are speaking up, defending Palestinian rights and Israeli civil society, and in resistance to Netanyahu's government. Now, what we also see is a lot of Jews just don't care anymore. They're just fed up. They don't want to have anything to do with it, or they're just highly critical. And those are the two groups that are currently growing in the United States. Now, ironically, evangelical Christians are often found to embrace the one state because they think this is going to bring, the end of the times and apocalypse and whatever's supposed to happen when the world ends. And at the same time, very left people are also embracing the one state solution, but because they are looking for justice and equality for all. So I want to just, now that I've done that little summary of where we're at, focus on how this is played out in our country, and I'm going to focus on children's literature because I just wrote a young adult book and I've been studying this topic. But if you think about it, where we're going to be in this country really depends on what our children learn and what kind of people and values they develop. So if you think about it, in pop culture, the stereotypes for Palestinian or Arab are terrorist, religious extremist, misogynist. Those are the words that usually come to mind. So think about what happens in your mind when you think of the word Arab or Palestinian. How many people think, oh, the people who invented algebra and coffee, or the Palestinians, don't they have great poets like Mahmoud Darwish and Taha Muhammad Ali? And have you ever tasted their food, their spices, sumac and za'atar? Wow. Or, those are the things that people don't think about. So this erasure of Palestinian reality starts very early in children's literature. And I want to give a nod to my friend and colleague, Nora Lester-Murad, who also just wrote a young adult novel about Palestine, because we've been working on this project. And so a lot of what I'm going to say is from the stuff that we've developed and stuff that I've learned doing this. So when you look at children's literature, there are a couple of themes that you can see. One is cultural appropriation and erasure through the denial of Palestinian reality, and then erasure through just pure deception. You also can see this kind of both sidesism where people feel like, why don't these guys just sit down and get along? Everything is really fine here if they could just be friends and sing Kumbaya. And then the last thing you see is that when people do present, a book about Palestine that's realistic and honest, there is often huge pushback, accusations of anti-Semitism if there's anything sympathetic to Palestine or critical of Israel. And just to give you a flavor for what this world is like, back in 2004, there was a book called Israel ABCs, a book about the people and places of Israel. And in this ABC book, B is for Bedouin. So the text reads, Bedouins are Arab people who come from Israel's deserts. Now, the problem with that little line is that the Bedouins lived in those deserts for many, many hundreds of years, long before the Israeli state. And the Israeli state took over the deserts they were living in. So this little picture book has it all upside down. And then in 2018, there was the book P is for Palestine, another ABC book. And this book created huge pushback. Bookstores that carried it were yelled at. Synagogues were all gone crazy. There was a big fight in Facebook, and people were accused of anti-Semitism and fomenting hatred and violence. And one of the big issues was that I was for Intifada. And so those folks said this book just celebrates violence and terror. But the author said, wait a minute, Intifada is a celebration of resistance against an oppressive occupation. So again, a total different reality. And then in 2021, there was a book called Ra Ra Mujdara. And this is a 12-page board book for little kids like 1 to 4. And it has a tagline, everybody likes hummus, but that's just one of the great variety of foods found in Israel amongst its diverse cultures. And it totally ignores the fact that hummus is found throughout the Arab world. Eastern European Jews came to the historic Palestine and to Israel, fell in love with the cuisine, and now they too love hummus. So again, culinary appropriation, everything is upside down. And one of the best examples is our friend Big Bird. So in 2022, there was a Welcome to Israel with Sesame Street. And this could have been written, and for all I know was, by AIPAC, which is the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is a really powerful pro-Israel lobby in the States. And there are so many things wrong with it, but one of the things is, where in the world is Israel? And there's this map that is Israel and the territories. It's all mustard color. There is no mention that there's occupied territories. And if you kind of squint, you can see this little dotted line, which outlines the occupied territories. So they've just evaporated the where Palestinians live and the sort of whole history and the conflict. What do families do? They live on farms and grow olives and avocados. And then there's a picture of an ancient olive grove, hundreds and hundreds of years old, that was planted by Palestinian peasants. So no acknowledgement that that's who did that. They talk about how falafel is a popular food. And the picture is an Orthodox Jew in a market. And it doesn't acknowledge that, first of all, he probably wouldn't eat this stuff because it's not kosher, but also this is an Arabic food that Israelis have fallen in love with. So again, cultural and culinary appropriation and a total lack of the acknowledgement of Palestinian existence. And ironically, the book claims that it's giving readers new tools to be smarter, kinder friends. And I would ask, how can a kid be friends with people that are invisible? 20% of the Israeli population is Palestinian. If you were a kid, you would never, ever know that. And just recently, there was a book called Baba, What Does My Name Mean? About a little Palestinian refugee who asks her father what my name means. And then they go on this magical adventure that's full of the richness and the culture of Palestine. And last 2021, this book was censored by the Philadelphia Free Library due to inappropriate cultural norms. It's stunning that this continues to go on. And we also see the erasure of Palestinian reality in books for older children. There are occasional books about coexistence, and you often see a photo of East Jerusalem with the Al-Aqsa Mosque alongside with the title Israel, blah, blah, blah. And just that cover alone, that's not Israel. That's East Jerusalem. It's the Palestinian side of Israel. It was seized in the '67 war. It's illegally occupied. Israel has declared it the undivided capital of Israel. None of that is mentioned in these books. The Palestinians are erased. And in these coexistence books, they're usually written from the point of view of an Israeli kid who bumbles across a Palestinian kid, and they both play soccer and everything's fine. And there is a studious ignoring of what the conflict is about, or any critical information about the occupation. Or some of these books do have the occupation front and center, but their idea of how to get through this is through love and understanding and sharing. And they don't talk about how the fact that they have to resolve the political issues and the settler colonial issues and the military issues. Those are never in these books. But it doesn't have to be this way. So more books are being written by people from the Middle East and getting published, on topics like wearing a hijab. There's a wonderful new book for kids, for little kids, Hannah's Hundreds of Hijabs, a celebration of hijabs. There's a wonderful new book called Cities, Birds, a Gaza story about a kid living in Gaza during a bombardment that is totally appropriate for children. But there's almost nothing on the young adult level. And when I researched this over the past maybe 15, 20 years, I found a total of 15 books written for young adults. And as I mentioned, when these kinds of books do get published, there's often extreme pushback, or they're just ignored and disappeared. And when we interviewed teachers and librarians who used these books, they were accused of anti-Semitism, they were censored, they were called in front of their union or their principal, they were, some of them lost their jobs, they had death threats, they were doxxed. It was just a wild response to, reading Baba, what does my name mean? And so these kinds of accusations, or the fear of these accusations, along with the lack of books, is a major factor as to why Palestine is not taught in schools. And people feel like it's just too much hassle. It's too controversial. It's almost like these books are banned before they're even written. And I think that people, activists, writers, progressives, working in solidarity with BIPOC communities and Arab communities can do a lot better than that. And, I think we should think about, why is that important? Well, we learn about people by hearing their stories, and this is true for children and adults. And also, people learn about themselves by seeing themselves reflected back in stories. We also know that understanding Palestinian culture is a gateway to understanding other Arab cultures. And, their Palestinian diaspora community is huge. It's all over the US, in Brooklyn, Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago. It's part of our country. And it's also true that Palestinians are the longest lasting non-resolved refugee group in the world. So there are a lot of reasons why people need to know what's going on. And then if you look at Israel, which is very important to the United States, to the Middle East, to peace and justice, to all the things we worry about, there are 5.5 million people living under occupation and 2 million people with second-class citizenship. So we need our children to understand this region and all its diversity and complexity. And we should encourage our kids to have historical and media literacy. And, the other critical piece of this environment is that we need more support for teachers and librarians. And that's why, one of the reasons why Nora and I are developing guidelines focused on what do teachers do when they're accused of anti-Semitism, which no one wants to be accused of. But I should add that it's very complicated for teachers. School teachers do not have the same rights in terms of freedom of speech, academic freedom, that the general public has. They have different labor protections. They risk harassment and surveillance. All of this depends on their school system. Is it a public or private school? Who controls the curriculum? Do they have support from the union or from a community? So there are a lot of things that come up for teachers that make it very hard. But nonetheless, this is very important work to do, because for teachers, for librarians, for parents, for grandparents, if we are working to uplift anti-racist work with our own children and grandchildren, we need to do this. We need to be honest with our children about settler colonialism, whether it's the US or Australia or South Africa or Israel. And if we're going to ground US history in the removal of indigenous peoples and the foundational role of slavery, and we need to make that clear. And then we need to show other populations where this has happened. So this, I would say, is all part of an effort to decolonize our understanding of people and history. So this conversation actually goes way beyond Palestine, and it exists in a world with rising levels of white supremacy, racism, Islamophobia, and real anti-Semitism. It's also important to be aware that there are an extensive number of, quote, pro-Israel groups that monitor all speech, all publications, all books on Palestine. And these groups generate negative responses. So they organize grassroots responses, accusing people of anti-Semitism. So we're talking about Stand With Us, Camera, Amcha, Israel's Strategic Affairs Committee. There's a whole bunch of them. And their favorite weapon is to accuse people of anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, they use what's called the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and I'm happy to talk more about this more if you want, which has unfortunately been adopted by the US State Department and many states and nations all over the world. And basically, their definition includes that any criticism of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic. So this really is used to muzzle people and censor people. And if folks want a much more nuanced discussion of what is anti-Semitism, I suggest that you Google the Jerusalem Declaration. So the IRA definition was meant to stimulate discussion, but it's functionally used to to muzzle dissent and to accuse people of anti-Semitism. And we see this impact on children's literature and writers, on teachers and librarians. And one of the things we need to think about is how do we organize our brain around this? And I think the first thing to remember is that Israel is a state. And I would argue that the state should be distinguished from Jews as a religion, a culture, a people, a religious group, however we want to describe ourselves. And some of us embrace Zionism, which is a national movement privileging Jews in historic Palestine, but some of us don't. And in a democratic society, citizens have a right to criticize policies of a state. And what we see is that many religious leaders, academics, and activists are challenging this longstanding belief in Israeli exceptionalism, that you can't criticize Israel because of the Holocaust, because Jewish trauma is unique. Their suffering and victimhood is different than everyone else's. And people are really challenging that assumption that has gone on for decades. And I would argue that the accusation of anti-Semitism must be credibly nested within opposition to white nationalism, racism, and Islamophobia. And that if we do not distinguish between valid critiques of the policies of the Israeli state and anti-Semitism, then ultimately we're allowing the right-wing forces to define our vocabulary. And the word anti-Semite will ultimately be meaningless, particularly at a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise and we really need to know how to identify it and oppose it. And as you can imagine, publishers are not immune to all these forces. So I'm going to turn now to my book to give you a flavor for how one author is struggling with all this. So my book is called Finding Melody Sullivan. Here it is. I have the website on the chat. This is basically what I would call a stealth Palestine book. So I don't want people who pick it up to know that there's a whole bunch of Palestine in it, because I wanted to sneak in under the radar. And it's a book about trauma, personal and political, about loss, relationships, love, teens trying to figure out how to live a moral life, all the kinds of big issues that teenagers start thinking about that we are still, thinking about. But the thing that makes this book very different is that much of the drama takes place in Hebron in the West Bank. And so part of my motivation for having Palestine be an actual character in the book is the total absence of and distortion of the Palestinian experience, narratives, history in children's literature. And I would say in the world of children's literature, the publishing industry has actually made a vocal commitment to uplifting what are called own voices, which are voices that are not usually heard, and diverse voices. And publishers can really do much better by incorporating Palestinian voices into their commitment to center diversity, and also by taking a stand to defend both Palestinian writers and writers on Palestine. But all of this is very theoretical. And so I want to show you how I tried to interest young adults, because I don't want to be preachy. I want to normalize these conversations, and I want Palestine to be easily in the story and not put into the story for some odd reason. So a part of this is figuring out how to tell a good story. So in a novel, it's important to entice the reader to start caring about something they don't know anything about. And the way you do that is to tell a really good story, to make the characters and their crises real and compelling, and to evoke empathy in diverse voices and diverse characters. So I have three main characters, the big one being Melody Sullivan, and they each represent sort of different voices in this conflict. So I'm just going to show you how I start out the book, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. So this is the first page. Melanie gazed out the wide window of her favorite diner, the Buttered Biscuit, as an orange-bellied towhee foraged in the thick shrubbery, and the earthy smell of old coffee drifted over her face, reminding her of the pile of unwashed mugs her dad had left in the sink. Her dense red curls were squashed by a black baseball cap, the visor on backwards. Yaz, my dad said that bird is on some endangered list. Did you know that? Yasmina popped a loud pink bubble and tucked a stray hair into her blue hijab. A rim of sweat had collected on her forehead, and the black coal lining her brown eyes glistened. Melanie rolled her basketball, sticky wet with cut grass, across the table. Don't be gross. Yasmina grabbed a paper napkin to wipe the green formica surface. Just because I'm older doesn't mean I have to clean up after you. Thanks, Mom. The words slipped out before Melanie could stop them. Instinctively, her fingers went to the fading pink scars on her wrist. She always expected them to be red and raw, a screaming billboard for her grief. Yasmina's eyes narrowed as she watched Melody trace the raised, bumpy lines. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, Melody preempted her. She wasn't in the mood for Yasmina's pity or understanding. That bird's just like me, endangered. Melody meant to sound flippant, but instead it came out sounding pathetic, like a bird with a broken wing. The two friends stared across the table, a tense silence. The ball bounced onto the faux leather seat, and Yasmina wedged it against the wall as the smell of fried onions and sizzling bacon wafted into their faces. The speckled formica counter across from the booth was lined with customers and steaming cups of coffee. A multi-leveled plastic display of pies turned slowly near the cash register. Melanie folded her hands into her lap, thoughts unfinished as usual. Sometimes she felt so broken, so unfixable, even Yaz couldn't help her. The waitress hustled over with their food. Okay, darlings, that's 2 Cokes, 1 diet, 1 regular, 1 cheeseburger, tomato on the side, 1 donut. Melanie nodded. Thanks. She frowned as she spotted a tall, gangly teenager peeking from behind the waitress. Aaron. Fuck. Melanie reached for her cheeseburger and whispered, Mr. Not So Cute is here again. Like an annoying brother who won't leave me alone. Hello, lover boy. Yasmina popped another bubble, wrapped her gum in a paper napkin, and slid the donut toward her side of the table. Aaron winced, then cleared his throat after the waitress disappeared. Hi. Awkward silence. He slid his hands into the pockets of his jeans and shifted uncomfortably from side to side, the cuffs too short, exposing white socks. His eyes were framed by black glasses. Yasmina smiled. Are you stalking us or something? Aaron blushed and waved his hand. Oh, no, really, no. Well, what's up? Melanie asked, taking a loud slurp of Coke. Aaron took a deep breath. Could I join you two, like for a Coke or something? Melanie side-eyed Yasmina, but her friend slid over toward the window and chirped. Sure. She patted her hand on the seat, jangling 2 gold bangles. God, Yaz is always so cheerful. This dork tried to kiss me in fucking preschool, and it's been downhill ever since. Should have whacked him with a Lego or something. The waitress appeared again, ready to take Aaron's order. I'll have a Coke. He looked at Yasmina. Not that hungry? Yasmina nodded. The burgers aren't halal. And not kosher, Aaron said. Too bad. So we're in the same boat, Yasmina smiled. Oh, Aaron and Yasmina having this little bonding moment over food. So not in the mood for his klutzy nerdiness. She caught a whiff of his citrusy sour man sweat. Don't you get tired of keeping track? Melody asked. Eat this, don't eat that. I can barely keep track of what I had for dinner last night. Not that my dad has the slightest idea how to cook. Kosher? My grandma did that, but my mom never. She smirked. Personally, I'm worried about those awful slaughterhouses, so maybe I should just be a vegetarian. Wipe that crooked grin off your face, girl, Yasmina said. I could go all veggie, except for the part about not eating hamburgers. Melanie pretend chomped. Ha, laughed Yasmina. I know, I'm a shameless carnivore, and you two are serious about religion. It's so weird. I just don't get all the rules. Life's already too complicated. But I love you anyway, said Yasmina. Suddenly serious, she turned toward Aaron. You know, Jews and Muslims really have a lot in common, like us. Aaron raised his eyebrows. Are you for real? Oh, is Yaz going to do her religion as a force for good and can unite us speech, children of Abraham, blah, blah, blah. Oh, God, not with Aaron. Better introduce some reality here. Then there's my dad. Melanie rubbed her nose ring. Catholic, but so not Catholic. That priest abuse shit was the final straw. It's so perverted. Gross. So that's how the book starts. So I've set it up with 3 characters in a small college town in Vermont. Melanie Sullivan is 16 years old. Her mother has just died of breast cancer. She's pretty grief-stricken and she writes this angsty poetry. Yasmina Khadour is a year older. All of these kids have known each other since preschool. She's a practicing Muslim, wears a hijab. She's Melody's rock. She's ambitious. She wants to be an engineer. She plays basketball. And then there's Aaron Shapiro, who's this sort of klutzy, nerdy guy who wants to be a rabbi, has a total crush on Melody, thinks he can rescue her from her grief. So I have these 3 very different characters, and now I can explore both their personal journeys and their personal traumas, and then their political journeys once this moves to Palestine. And so I've got all the different voices happening. Now, in a novel, something very terrible has to go wrong, so something does, and I won't tell you what it is because I want you to read the book. But Melody's very emotionally distant father, who's a professor in this college town, he's an archaeologist, drags her to Jerusalem where he's presenting for a conference and leaves her to wander the old city and negotiate her Israeli cousins. And she thinks that Yasmina can just hop on a bus and come spend time with her in Jerusalem, and is shocked to find out that Yasmina can't. And then at the same time, Aaron finally summons his courage through texting to declare his love for her. So there's all that going on. And then the terribly wrong thing happens. And Melody is just totally freaking out and she needs her friend. So as teenagers do, she impulsively finds the Arab bus to Bethlehem, hops on it and goes to find her friend. And so at this point, Aaron is totally freaking out because his source of information is his temple community, his father, and his cousin who lives in a settlement and is an Israeli soldier. And so at this point, Palestine actually enters the book as another character. So I'm just going to show you how I start sharing what this whole journey is going to be about. So Melody has been on this bus. The woman who sits next to her's name is Khalud. She's this lovely nurse who starts narrating the environment. So part of Melody's actual journey through Palestine is narrated by the Palestinians who are taking her on this journey. So if those of you who haven't been to Bethlehem, there's this huge military terminal, big concrete thing. And a lot of Israelis and American Jews call this whole thing a fence, but at this point, this is clearly not a fence. Khalud, Aaron called it a fence. Melanie stared at the huge wall of concrete as the bus turned into the checkpoint, her nose almost pressed against the window. She felt her pulse thumping in her head. That wall looks like a fucking prison. She looked around at the other passengers in the bus. No one seemed anxious or even surprised. So this is normal? Melanie took out her phone and snapped pictures through the window. Wait till Aaron sees this. She focused on a discordant blue and white sign, "Peace be with you." Peace? Really? Not exactly. Khalud grabbed her arm and pushed it down. Don't do that, dear. This is a military terminal. You don't want to annoy the Israeli soldiers. Oh, right. That was dumb. Melanie stuck her phone into her pack and blushed. What would they do if they saw me? She pulled her baseball cap down to cover her face a bit. Should I be scared or am I just plain stupid? She tugged on her cap. My dear, they might yell, delete your photos, confiscate your phone. They could arrest you, send you back to Jerusalem, depending on their mood. Their mood? Her mind flashed forward, her father storming into some dismal basement prison cell to find her handcuffed and hungry. She could see the headlines in the college newspaper back home. 16-year-old daughter of college professor arrested on spy charges in Israel. That would get his attention. Dear, Bethlehem is a walled city under occupation. We live and breathe at the whim and will of the soldiers. They're mostly young boys and girls not much older than you, but they have huge power over our lives. Every day can be a surprise. Khalud smiled. But you're an American, you'll be okay. Melanie felt a new bolt of anxiety. She grabbed her silver bracelet and pressed her fingers around it and stared at her wrist. Stay away from the handcuffs, okay? Come, let's go. Khalud snatched Melody's hand and motioned her to leave the bus with the other passengers. They walked up a steep concrete-covered passageway into the checkpoint, through a gate, and began threading into lines guided by blue metal fencing. Melanie stared open-mouthed at the soldiers watching overhead, automatic rifles pointed down at the travelers below. She felt bewildered, but Khalud gestured for her to push through a 6-foot-high, narrow steel turnstile into another queue. The light on the turnstile turned red, green, closed, open. Melanie waited for the green and pushed. On her third attempt, she heard a welcome click and felt the smooth steel bar against her skin. A voice in Hebrew barked from a loudspeaker in a control room somewhere. Melanie looked around, trying to figure out where the voice came from. People were pressed against other travelers, all waiting. Her calves' lower back tightened up from the anxious standing still. This sweaty smell of day laborers mixed with the perfume of an elegant woman in a wide hat, standing in an expanse of multicolored hijabs. Melanie looked at the faces around her and felt a mix of tension and resignation. Unlit cigarettes hung from the lips of some of the men. A heavily armed soldier leaned up against a white wall, scanning the crowd, gripping his automatic weapon, deliberately chewing gum. Melanie looked up and noticed cameras everywhere. It is a fucking prison. So I'm going to stop there. And I want to make one last comment before we open this up to Q&A, which is that as a old white Jewish lady, I really had to earn my creds to write a book about Palestine. So I've been working in the region. I started work in 1997, and I started going annually in 2004 up to the pandemic. And I hope to be going back soon. And so I have multiple friendships, have worked in clinics, have stayed in refugee camps. I did a ton of interviews from my documentary film, which was telling the story of Israel-Palestine through the voices of Palestinians who lived 48, 67, dispossession, whatever part of the story we're telling. And so with writing this book, I constantly was checking back with Palestinian friends and colleagues. And I want to particularly acknowledge my friend Lubna Alzaru, who came from Hebron and actually was the sort of guardian angel to be sure that I got all the details correct. So I do want to thank her. So I'm going to stop. I should just tell you that there is a website, which is on the chat, AliceRothchildBooks.com. You can order the book through there, and it also gives you the name of the press if you want to just go to the press. And I also am developing materials just for readers and for teachers that will be building on that website. And you can also sign up for my MailChimp if you want to know more things that I'm writing and doing, since I'm writing and doing lots of things. So questions?
Wow. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Should I look at the chat, Paul? Are you going to unmute yourself and read the chat, or how are we doing?
I could, you could read it too, but I can ask the question that I put in myself. Could
Okay,
you
so yeah.
more about the Jerusalem definition and the IRA definition?
Okay, so first of all, let me, I'm just going to put in the chat the real names of these things. So it's the Jerusalem, whoops, I have to spell Jerusalem, Jerusalem Declaration, and the IHRA, whoops, sorry, IHRA definition. Be good if I could spell. So what happened was that I think it was in 2016, a group of international scholars got together to try to define anti-Semitism. And they had a whole, conversation and blah, blah, blah. And then they wrote this piece. And the piece says, anti-Semitism is, and they list a lot of the usual things, attributing Jews to controlling the world and the banking system, negative stereotypes about Jews, the usual things that you would think about if you were thinking about what is anti-Semitic. But then 7 of the 11 examples that they gave were different kinds of criticism of Israel. And this is highly problematic because it's conflating Israel with Jewish people. And it's not acknowledging that Israel is a state, which is different than the people who are Jewish, some of whom live in Israel, some who don't, some who support it, some who don't. So the problem is that the State Department, and I think it's 35 states now, have adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and now they're calling people on it. So if you're a teacher and you say something critical of Israel, and the kid goes home and tells their parent, and the parent reports it to the principal can accuse that teacher of anti-Semitic statements. And so this has become a major, major, major problem, basically all over the world. Now, the Jerusalem Declaration was written in response to the IRA definition. So the Jerusalem Declaration was another, convention of academics and thought people, and they wanted to have a very thoughtful and much more nuanced definition of anti-Semitism. So they listed all the usual horrible things that are the usual horrible things, but then they said, let's think about context and nuance. And I'll just give you an example. So let's say someone says something hateful about Israel. So the first question is, in what context is that? It could be that that person is an anti-Semite and hates Israel because it's quote, a Jewish state. Or it could be that that person said something hateful about Israel because they've just bombed Gaza and killed 100 women and children, and that's maybe an appropriate response. Or it could be that that person said something hateful about Israel because they're Palestinian and they have just had some horrific home demolition, and they're very angry with the Israeli soldiers who just destroyed their house. So they really focus on what kind of statements are being said, and then dissecting out context and nuance and intent, and making a difference between hating people and commenting on oppressive situations. So you can get a much more in-depth look if you can just Google, the IRA definition and the Jerusalem Declaration, and you can get a much, there are pages of stuff. But that will give you a better sense of what the conversation is about anti-Semitism that's going on in this country and how it's being abused. I suggest a good movie to see is Boycott. Have you guys seen Boycott, which deals with several people who supported boycotting Israel because they couldn't tolerate the policies of Israel? And then again, that has been made criminalized in this country, and then all sorts of terrible things happened to them and they had to go to court. And it's a really wonderful film that is in the same vein as this. So, okay. Paul, should I just read these?
Why don't you just read them? Yeah.
Okay, we don't have so many. Okay, how much support in Israel for Palestinian rights? So in Israel, first of all, when we say Israel, we really mean Jewish Israel. So I would say that the 20% of Israelis who are Palestinian support Palestinian rights, right? So the 80% of Israel that are Jewish, there is very, very little support for Palestinian rights in Israel. If you look at the protests that have been going on, I don't know how many people have been following this, but Netanyahu has been trying to change the laws so that the Supreme Court, which I should tell you, has not been a bastion of liberalism and has not been good for Palestinians, but they're going to make it even worse. They're kind of defanging the Supreme Court so that the Supreme Court isn't as powerful as the Knesset, which is the parliament. And so this is looked at by Jewish Israelis as a really bad thing and as a challenge to Israeli democracy. So the amazing, amazing thing is that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelis, and it's not that big a country, have been out demonstrating week after week after week against this plan. And they caused so much havoc, and they blockaded highways, and they did all sorts of wild things that Netanyahu backed down. He didn't back off, he backed down. And he said, well, we're going to put this all on hold until, because the Knesset was going on vacation for Passover. When the Knesset comes back, we'll think about it again. And I haven't seen anything now that the Knesset is back. But what I did read was that Ben-Gvir, which is the guy who's in charge of security, who's just, I have to call him a fascist. There's no other. I mean, he's so bad that he couldn't get into the army because he was so right-wing that the army didn't want him. And now he's in charge of the army. He's been trying to negotiate for his own private militia in Israel that would be responsible for basically containing the Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. And what I've read is that Netanyahu kind of backed off, but he promised him his private militia. So there's all sorts of shenanigans going on. But the interesting thing is that if you look at what the protesters are saying and calling for, they're not noticing that Israel isn't a democracy. They're not noticing that a fifth of the country doesn't, this is a democracy for Jews, not for everybody. And they're not noticing that there are millions of people that are completely controlled by Israel that are not living any experience of democracy in the occupied territories. Now, last week I had the amazing experience of meeting and being on a panel with a guy named Hagar Matai, who is the editor of Plus 972, and I will put that in the chat because this is an important thing to know about if you're interested. Plus 972 is an Israeli web magazine. Plus 972 is the telephone area code, just in case you're wondering. And they're basically the left voice in Israel. And what he said, he's the editor, and what he said is, people were protesting, and just completely ignoring the contradictions of the facts. And now there's a smaller branch in the protests that is noticing that Israel isn't a democracy, that it doesn't have a constitution, that it, occupies all this land. So now there's sort of different streams of thought in the protests. The majority still haven't noticed, but there's this little crack in the wall kind of thing. And there are even people talking about Palestinian rights in this little subgroup. But again, the vast, like 99% of Israeli Jews don't even think much about Palestine. It's not even one of their issues. Their issues are price of housing and social supports and health insurance and all the issues that people have. Okay, let's see. Okay, any U.S. movements? Oh, so this was U.S. Oh, let's see, I did that. Any U.S. movements to support Palestinians in Israel? So the question is, are there U.S. movements to support Palestinians in Israel? And the answer is yes. Some of the big organizations are Jewish Voice for Peace. You don't have to be Jewish to be in Jewish Voice for Peace. It's an anti-Zionist, progressive Jewish organization. There's the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. There is Sabil, which is a church organization. There are an enormous number of faith-based groups that are working on this. And there are some very excellent sources of information that come out of the U.S. One of them is called Mondoweiss, which is another web magazine, which is basically Jewish left in the U.S. putting out stuff. And the other thing that's in the U.S. is Palestine Chronicle. I mean, it's more international, but the person who edits it lives part-time in the U.S. So there's tremendous amount of access and local organizing. I mean, in Seattle, we have a lot of smaller groups. There's Palestinian, which is a group that organizes demonstrations. There's a feminist Palestinian women's collective. I mean, every city has its bubbling of activists. So there's a tremendous amount of action with this. And on the college campuses, there's Students for Justice in Palestine on lots and lots of campuses. In Washington, the University of Washington is called SUPER, S-U-P-E-R, which is Students for Palestinian Rights or something like that, that does the same work as Students for Justice in Palestine. And there are a lot of Arab student associations that also do this. Okay. What have you heard from youth who've read this book and adults who've used this book with kids, youth plan to use this? Okay. So first of all, this book came out in January. And the book is published by a small progressive publisher who has exactly $0 for marketing. So this book gets out because I'm out talking about it. I'm in conferences. I'm applying to the American Library Association national meetings. I'm working on getting it out there. So I don't think it's been out long enough to, for me to be able to answer a lot of that question. In terms of youth who've read this, before I had it published, I had it focus group with some teenagers. Now, first of all, getting teenagers to read a book they don't have to read is really hard, I would like to say. And the ones that actually read it, I would say, well, what'd you think? And did it sound authentic? And did the voice move you? And they would, yeah, it's good. I go, so that was the response I got from teenagers. I just did a very interesting program with a bar mitzvah group here at a local Reconstructionist temple that has an anti-Zionist rabbi, another very new phenomenon. So I'm dealing with some 12 and 13-year-olds who are studying Israel-Palestine in a progressive way. But their knowledge base was really small. I mean, we were talking and, I said, well, what question do you have? And they were like, well, why can't they just get along? That was their level of understanding. And when I probed a little deeper, none of them knew what a Jewish settler was. So we had a lot of stuff to cover. But, at the end of it, they all wanted to buy the book. So, I think kids can get interested in it, but they have to be exposed to it. They have to have some adult say, you should read this, or some youth group say, this is the book we're going to read this month, or something like that. In terms of adults who've read the book, obviously people who hated the book didn't call me, but I've had a lot of adults like it. And if you like it, please write a review on Amazon. It isn't hard and it really helps. And so I am hoping that church groups, temple groups, community organizations will want to use this group in their schools, because it's an easy entry. It's a soft landing into Palestine, and it's designed to not be polemic. the kids find things out because they're in the middle of a lot of trouble. And so it makes them question. And it doesn't say, this is what you should believe. I mean, Aaron has to deal with the pictures that Melody is sending back, but he can't believe them because it's just so different than what he learned. And so there are all sorts of crises of knowledge and, you know, in-depth discussions that happen because things are happening. So I think it would be a fun book to work with kids. I'm also working with a group that does multicultural books, and we're planning some programs in the fall. But again, this is just taking off, and it needs to come up from the bottom because it's not like there's a huge advertising business going on to support this book. Okay.
It's a good
Oh,
question.
anyway, the ages, this book is, because there is sexual assault in this book, and I use the word fuck a lot because that's how Melody talks. This book is most suitable for 15 and up, although 12 and 13-year-olds with content warning could probably handle it fine because they see this all the time anyway. So it's young adults, so but not like 8-year-old young adults. Okay. And I always say young adults 15 to 85. Okay. Are there any democratic liberal Arabic states with open societies, tolerant? That's a tough question because the answer is mostly no. During the Arab Spring, there was an uprising from the grassroots, and it was clear that people are yearning for democratic, liberal, tolerant Arabic societies. I think Tunisia got the closest, but Arab states have historically not been democratic or liberal. And part of that is the history of the region. Part of that is the fallout from colonialism and how, you know, after the wars, the different European states divided the whole place up, and France took this and the UK took this, and then they installed leaders that they wanted. And so the whole sort of democratic process has been totally usurped. And I don't know what would happen if people left people alone and didn't send them millions of dollars of weaponry and, you know, support the most dictatorial people. Again, it's not something that we see, but it's certainly something we know that people are yearning for. And when I've been, you know, in Palestine and talking to young people, and I also work with this group called We Are Not Numbers, which is a group in Gaza, and it's a group of young Gazans who want to be writers, and we mentor them and we mentor their writing. All these young people want a democratic, open, tolerant society. So I think the people want it, the leaders aren't there yet, and certainly aren't getting any help from us.
The lack of one is frequently cited or has been cited by Jewish people to me as a justification for keeping the Arab population relatively powerless, because they say,
yeah, right,
you know,
but that's a total non sequitur. Yeah, right. That's a non sequitur. That's like saying, you know, we shouldn't let Native American people have their rights because, you know, they have so much alcoholism and diabetes, they could not handle it. You know, if you oppress people, then they're oppressed. If you don't oppress them, then they can flower and figure out who they are and have their voice and yada, yada, yada. So I think that's a very, very racist kind of argument, frankly, but people make it. Okay. Follow-up question to the U.S. support of Palestine. Do you think the U.S. and any other worldwide movements to support Palestinians will have an impact on Israel? So I think that, first of all, I don't know the answer to that question, but I do think that, first of all, the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, which started in 2005, hasn't had an economic impact like, you know, crushing the hummus industry, but it has had a reputational impact, so that a lot of corporations just choose not to open up businesses in Israel, although Israel has a very flourishing economy, because it's seen as a hotspot or something, a place that's just going to give them trouble. One of the very interesting things that has been happening with the protest movements in Israel is that the tech industry has been leaving, because the tech industry loved Israel because there were all these well-educated people and they poured money into the tech industry. And so tech industries had their companies there. And a lot of them have been leaving during this current conflict and thinking, you know, we'll just go to Silicon Valley where it's a little quieter and we don't have to deal with all this craziness. So they were sort of self-divesting, which was a fascinating little side thing that was happening. But I think that the way to have impact on Israel is to challenge the mythology and to convince countries like the US that spend $3.8 billion of military aid a year and a huge amount of political cover, that is not an appropriate way to behave, is what's going to change the situation. Whether that can happen, I don't know. But I do think that if I look over the last 25 years, we now have Palestinians and hijabi wearing women in Congress. We have bills introduced by Betty McCollum calling attention to, the killing of Palestinian children. We have Bernie Sanders. There's much more stuff going on in our Congress than there was 50 years ago. And the other thing that's really important to know is that if you look at younger generations in the US, they do not stand with Israel the way their parents and grandparents did. And this is true of Jewish kids as well as non-Jewish kids. I think the biggest threat we have is from evangelical Christians, because there are there are like millions and millions of them, and they're much, much bigger than the Jewish population. And they pour a huge amount of money into settlements. They support the settlements. I just have to say goodbye to my grandchild. Hello. Goodbye. And so Christian Zionists are actually the biggest threat that we have in terms of moving forward in terms of any kind of progress. I don't know what the surrounding Arab countries are going to do with this Abraham Accord. It's interesting. Apparently, Saudi Arabia, I don't know the whole details, but they didn't do the full signing of everything. And there have not been more countries stepping up to say, oh, I want to recognize Israel and forget about the Palestinians. So I just don't know how it's all going to play out. So we have to keep doing what we can do and to uplift the voices of Palestinians in our country. For instance, one of the things that I find very exciting now that I'm a writer and not a gynecologist, is there's a festival called the Palestine Rights Literature Festival. And we're having a meeting the second year, and I'm going to be reading at it. And this is a celebration of Palestinian writers. Well, 20 years ago, there was no celebration of Palestinian writers in English. There were Palestinian writers in Arabic, obviously. So this is new. This is part of the culture. There's people working in the world of ethnic studies that are very loud about Palestinian rights and defending Palestinian rights. So, in the academia, you see lots of changes, in student bodies, you see lots of changes, but it's a real uphill battle. There are also a lot more trips, delegations where people can get a real education about what's going on and not just, have a lovely time in the desert and go home and say, Israel's wonderful. Isn't the Israeli government a shaky coalition that may not last very long? Yes. So if you look at the last election, Netanyahu won. It's a parliament. So the way that the biggest party wins is by coalitioning with other parties. And so that means that tiny parties can have a huge amount of influence because bigger parties need them to make their majority. So in the analysis that I recently heard, if the Arab parties, there are some small Arab parties, had coalition together in a joint list like they've done in the past, and if Meretz had stuck together, which is the left in Israel, which is a teeny tiny thing, they would have won the government. So Netanyahu won by a little sliver. And every time he does something, the more right-wing people yell and scream and say they're going to leave. So this is a very shaky coalition. And I would be surprised if it has a long life. Netanyahu, we should remember, is very motivated in staying in power because he's under indictment and might go to jail, and he wants to stay out of it, which is one of the other reasons why he wants to limit the power of the judiciary, because then he can make whatever he wants to stay out of jail. So it's a touchy situation. But it likely will not last very long because it's not built on strong legs. And also because the level of fascistic behavior is even beyond what most Israelis can tolerate. And they've tolerated a lot. It's not like the alternative is like so much better, but it's just not so bad. Are you at risk being an American working in Gaza? So the question, I have to sort of dissect that question. The work that I do here in support, let's say, of Gazan writers, or I also work in support of a mental health facility in Gaza. I'm doing it for my study. I'm not employed by anybody. No one can fire me. I'm not particularly at risk. I mean, I can get, death threats on social media, but that's like as far as we get. I've been to Gaza 3 times and I'm trying to go again. And the main risk in trying to go to Gaza is, first of all, mostly the Israelis won't let you in. And so I've applied many times and they won't let me in, but sometimes they do. And I have no idea why, when, what mood they're in that they decide to let me in. But once I'm there, I have always been working with doctors, social workers, NGOs, women's groups, teachers, writers, a certain, families. And I have always been publicly Jewish and publicly American. And I have been welcomed. And so I would think that maybe if I walked up to Hamasnik and told him all the stuff, I might not be so welcome, but I have no idea. But my main risk is that I'll get, bombed by an Israeli bomb, or, the Gazans, they're sort of like, the story of the frogs in slowly boiling water. They live in a situation that, you get used to it, but it's completely intolerable. For instance, the Israelis have constant drones buzzing overhead all the time, 24/7. And these drones drive people crazy. And so they're constantly being surveilled. There's all this facial recognition, they're being surveilled. The Israelis know where everybody is. They have access to all their phones. I'm much more at risk from Israeli military than I am from Gazans. And Palestinian culture is incredibly welcoming. So my experience has literally always been, come into my house, have a cup of tea, let me feed you 7,000 pieces of pie. It's like, meet the family and the uncle and the grandmother, and then everybody has to tell me their story. And, it's that kind of Arab culture, it's famous for that culture. And fortunately, food is very good. So that's more been my experience. I know someone who was a journalist who got kidnapped in Gaza and, held for ransom for some Palestinian prisoner kind of thing. I suppose that could happen. It generally doesn't happen. Generally, people like me who come, not wanting to take anything, but wanting to be respectful, wanting to lend my expertise, wanting to be supportive, wanting to document, we're pretty welcome. Okay, unfortunately, we are seeing terrible acts of anti-Semitism in the United States and other countries. There were also neo-Nazi groups in Germany and the rise of fascism in Italy, as well as hatred of refugees from Muslim countries. What do you think is the cause of these groups increasing in size and influence? So this is all true. So I think that there are a lot of causes. First of all, I think a lot of the stuff existed in the shadows, always exists in the shadows. It seems to me that the Trump administration gave permission for these kind of folks to come out from under the rock and to be much more public and to be welcomed in the public sphere. And that has really just created this explosion of public acts of neo-Nazism and fascism and anti-Semitism in our country. I also think that this is also true in Europe. And I don't know enough about each European leader and the politics in each country, but certainly there is a rise of fascism in Europe. It seems to me that part of the issue is that if we look at the history of the world, of the planet, there have always been refugees and people fleeing for a better place and people moving from one country to another. And that's happening now like it's always been happening. But the response has been, instead of, the US come my huddled masses, and recognizing that refugees are a tremendous source of strength and workers and all sorts of good things that refugees bring to a country. Now the response is fear and keep people out, and the building of racism and Islamophobia, which comes from above and from the populace. And I'm sure there are a lot of other reasons that have to do with fear and poverty and oppression and the lack of our attention to social supports in this country, and people's fears of losing their jobs and having to blame someone. So you blame the guy from Mexico who is a perfectly legal person who could certainly contribute to US society. And most people don't understand in the US that refugees actually contribute to US society. They pay their taxes, they do all sorts of jobs that are important. This is not the myth. the myth is that refugees only take, and they're, evil rapists and all the things that the Trumpers say. And that's really become a very dominant narrative. And I think it gets increasingly scary with our peculiar response to gun violence, which is completely out of control. And the fact that people are not rioting in the streets and saying, take these guns out of people's hands and stop arming everybody is just stunning. And that's also feeding into, the tough white Aryan man with his gun. And that's really, really frightening. So I think, there are probably a lot of different movements. I think other people could probably chime in with some other responses to that, but those are things that come to mind.
Alice, I see a raised hand from Pamela.
Raised hand. Okay, Pamela.
I don't want to jump the line in the chat though, but
Go for it.
I was wondering what you think is gonna happen there, and also what you would like to see happen there, because I don't imagine they match.
Right. So there, meaning Israel, Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
So I honestly don't know what's going to happen, but I don't for a while think it's going to be good. Because one of the big issues is that unless Israeli Jews grapple with the consequences of Zionism and the consequences of Jewish supremacy and the consequences of having a foreign policy which involves bombing, 2 million people every couple of months, it's not going to get better. And in fact, the policies of the Israeli state only serve to make people more hopeless, more radical, more disenfranchised, and ultimately more violent, because they have nothing left to lose. And so this is a very, very dangerous road we're on. So, I don't know how it's going to get better. I do think that internationally, there's much more awareness of this problem. There are, like some of the Scandinavian countries are not doing things with Israel anymore, that there's more concern about this, but I don't see the political will in Europe and the US to change the situation. And, every time, Biden says there's no daylight between Israel and we'll support their democracy and blah, 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 it just makes me want to scream. So I don't think right now things are going to be better. But I have to hope that if we keep on keeping on, that ultimately the tide will turn, because it's not stable. Let me just finish. One of the most incredibly worrisome things about the state of Israel is that there is a growing ultra-Orthodox population, and the ultra-Orthodox tend to be the most right-wing, the most intolerant, the most rigid, and they have the most babies. So while the secular, more progressive Jewish population is having their 1 or 2 children, the ultra-Orthodox are having their 10 to 12 children. And if you take those numbers out, there is a point where the majority of Israelis will be ultra-Orthodox. And I always think, well, that's when Israel has its own little Hamas, because having the most right-wing people be the majority does not seem to me to be a good plan, but that's what the demographics is. So again, there are a lot of very, very worrisome things. There are also, political things going on internationally that are putting pressure on this whole situation, but it's very, very dangerous.
Who can vote
in Israel?
Yeah, in Israel.
Anyone
Are there
who's a citizen can vote.
so are there
So Palestinians with Israeli citizenship can vote. The problem is that there's rarely anyone they want to vote for. There are, I think, 3 small Arab party, they call them, in Israel, they don't call them Palestinians because that would mean that they were recognizing that they were actually from Palestine. They call them Arabs, which means they're kind of from one of those Arab places out there. So the Arab parties are small, but certainly Palestinians often vote for them. But many Palestinians are so disenchanted that they vote with their feet rather than their ballot box. The people in the occupied territories who are under occupation, they can't vote. They're completely disenfranchised. Let me go back to this chat thing. Okay. So Pat is talking about the small percentage of Jewish Israelis who care about Palestinian rights and do important work in the West Bank and protecting people, et cetera, et cetera. That's absolutely true. The problem is that it's, like a tiny, tiny part of the population. And I think what happened after Oslo, which was when there were big peace accords, quote, peace accords were signed, a lot of liberal-minded Israelis felt, okay, we're done, it's all set. And then there were the intifadas, and they were like, what? How could this be? And they never grappled with the great problems that were inherent in the Oslo Agreement and the fact that Zionism is a partly Jewish supremacy. So, a lot of liberals got very disenchanted and kind of are no longer doing any kind of lefty politics. And even the lefty ones are often Zionists, which is problematic because they're not dealing with the core problem. And, I say this with a lot of humility because we live in a country that has a huge amount of racism and issues. The thing that's different here is that a lot of people feel like that's a problem, whereas there, that's not a problem. So it's a different mindset. So here's a question. Have you heard of the censorship scandal in the publishing industry where the leading corporations like Scholastic are asking authors to tone down passages which refer to racism, racism in an effort to avoid the right-wing book bans in Israel, which is where they make the most, in schools, which is where they make the most money. Have you faced any such effort in your work? So I absolutely have heard about this. This is a big problem. And there was this book that is cited in the chat. This writer had this book, published by a little company that was then bought up by Scholastic, and every writer's dream is to be bought by Scholastic because they provide books all across the country to schools. So they're like the big guys. And then they asked her to take out, things about racism, and the book was about racism. So that was a problem. And so this is very scary because if Scholastic, ultimately Scholastic backed down, but then she was so pissed she wouldn't go with them. But if Scholastic is feeling the pressure, and it's not just some, crazy textbook writer in Florida or Texas, then we're really, really in trouble. So this is what I said in my talk. Publishing companies are feeling the censorship. They're feeling censorship about Palestine. They're feeling censorship about racism. You can't just pick your censorship. It all happens together in one big mess. So yes. Now, have I faced any such effort in my work? So my first 3 books, which were published, they're for grownups, about health and human rights, were published by, one was published by an academic press in London called Pluto Press. And 2 were published by a progressive press in the United States called Just World Books. Both of those are progressive publishing companies that like me and like my ideas. So I haven't faced that. And my young adult novel was published again by a small press, Cooney Press in Seattle. So I've never made it up into the big guns. So I have never hit the big censorship issues because I only have been, my books are not the kind of books that big publishers tend to want to publish. So, and it's also just so hard to get published. So anyway, I haven't had that in my work. Would it be okay to ask people to contact their members of Congress to stop our unconditional support for the Israeli government? Absolutely. I think the more your congressmen hear from you, the better. Most of them are not listening and will not listen, but they do count the numbers. And I think it's important to be heard over and over and over again. And, right now when there's a big Israeli assault on Gaza, and I don't know if you heard NPR this morning, but their assessment was they just didn't get the whole picture. Congress people have to hear from people who think that we need to stop unconditional support. Just to add to Alice's answer, there's also massive voter suppression gerrymandering happening in Israel, which robs Palestinians of the vote. Okay, so thank you for that comment. Anybody else have some question, comment, anything? We're all talked out. You've been very good.
Question where I see a parallel between what's happened in the United States to the treatment that we have given in the past to indigenous people, and what might happen in Israel, Palestine. Mm-hmm. And it strikes me, I'm wondering, is this a pattern
Mhm. Well, I'll tell you a story and then I'll answer that. So I was in Washington, D.C. with a guy who works at the Gaza Communal Health Program. And while we were doing some joint speaking, and while we were there, Israel started bombing Gaza. So he was like distraught because his family was there. And he wanted to go to the Museum of the American Indian in Washington. So we went, and there were all these dioramas of Indian native peoples doing their things. And he was staring at these dioramas and getting more and more upset. And finally, he had to leave. And when we got out, I said, "What's going on?" He said, "In 100 years, there will be museums with dioramas showing Palestinians doing their daily life because they will no longer be in existence." You know, it was just like, ah. So I think that the parallels are there. And the reason they're there is that we are both settler colonial countries. And we both had a sense of manifest destiny, that we can take land that's ours. And so countries that do that have parallels. So yes, absolutely, I think there are parallels. And settler colonialism is different than just regular colonialism. Like regular colonialism is, you know, when Britain took over India, they weren't planning to go live in India. They wanted to extract all the resources and send it home to the mother country. If you're a settler colonialist, you want to move there, but then you want to take the land, throw out the indigenous people, and keep it all for yourself. So that's settler colonialism. So it's a branch of colonialism. So you have to look at history and see which countries did it which way. Like Australia was a settler colonial country, so as was the US. So yeah, so the parallels are definitely there. Anything else? It's quite a lively bunch of questions here. Yes, Eleanor.
Yes, what can we do specifically that might help? I mean, of course, you know, no one of us can do something to change it, but sometimes small things can help.
So what can you do? So I think there are a lot of different layers to this. The first one is that everybody has family and community that they can talk with, that they can share books with, that they can share essays with, that they can share knowledge that they figure out and see if they can bring people over to understanding this, you know, conflict. I hate using the word conflict, but conflict that's been going on, and try to help people understand another way to see it and not just the one that's the dominant narrative. So educating yourself and educating your family and community is really critical. Another thing is that there are organizations you can join. There, if you're in a church, there are church organizations like Sabeel, and you know, you have to do a little investigation and see what who in your community or in your state is doing this kind of work. It's also very important to be in contact with your Congress people, because they do need to hear from us, and they need, and like we need to be like, I always think we need to be like mosquitoes, you know, buzzing around, annoying them a lot, so that they don't forget that there's another idea out there. And when, you know, someone like Rashida Tlaib says something and she gets a lot of pushback, send her an email telling her you really liked what she said. You know, it's like, give support to the people who have some power in our legislative bodies. I think the interesting thing about the boycott, divestment, sanction movement is that you can, you know, do it on the global scale, but you could also do it on the local scale. You could organize, if you belong to a food co-op, you could organize a boycott of Israeli wines that are usually, the grapes are usually grown in the West Bank on Palestinian land. You know, you can do local activities that both honor the boycott and also educate your community. So those are the kinds of things people need to do. You know, it's not rocket science, you know, and like this Saturday is Nakba Day. It's the anniversary of the Arab-Israeli war, where the war ended and 750,000 Palestinians were dispossessed and lost their land. And, you know, to have some kind of acknowledgement in your town or in your church or in your community, read some Palestinian poetry, talk about the history, you know, acknowledge these moments, I think is really important, and also is a way to educate your community and have it be part of the conversation. And then in your schools and libraries, it would be good to ask them to have books that are about Palestine for kids. And be sure they order them and see what happens when teachers use them. You know, and then support teachers who do use them. You know, I will have this paper out soon with all of this information, but you know, that's a really important thing to do. You know, the right wing has gone around and, you know, infiltrated every school district and every school board, and you know, they're starting from the bottom, working their way up. We can do that too. So I think the whole issue of book banning, and I mean, thinking first of all that we teach critical race theory is ridiculous, but in, you know, lower level schools, but also the idea that talking about racism is dangerous to children. I mean, this is all part of the same conversation. So get involved with your school board, make sure they're not doing that. You know, there are all sorts of ways to have some local impact. Let's see. So Paul is a member of Human Rights Awareness Palestine, affiliated with Massachusetts Peace Action. Sign you up so you receive occasional requests to contact. Oh, okay. So this chat note is telling you how to, you can sign up to get requests to contact your members of Congress. And I should tell you, if you join Jewish Voice for Peace, and like I've said, you don't have to be Jewish, they have a 501c4, which does political action. And if you sign up for their political action alerts, you will get, every time something comes up, there's something in the legislature, there's something in Congress that has to be supported or opposed, you get the message, you click the button, the message goes to all of your, you know, senators and congresspeople. You know, you can get into it in a way that doesn't take hours of the day trying to figure out how to do this. Okay, do you think American tourism to occupied territories will be a boon to those oppressed communities and make Israel fearful of taking unilateral military action in case they injure an American tourist? I don't think so. First of all, to have a boom in tourism requires the ability for people to be able to get into a region easily, to have adequate hotels and supports and not be worried about checkpoints. And, you know, it's such a difficult place to be that the way tourism functions now, it's like Christians going to Bethlehem, they get into a big bus that has special plates, they zoom through, they don't have to go through a checkpoint, they don't even see the checkpoint, they go to the churches that they want to see, then they hop on the bus and they come back after they buy a couple of olive wood crosses. I mean, that's what a lot of the tourism is. So I think tourism is not the answer. And also the Israelis have shown no problem in killing Americans. I mean, Rachel Corrie, you know, got crushed by a bulldozer, and they didn't seem to think that was a problem. So I don't think that having American bodies in the occupied territories helps. It helps us because we bear witness and we come home and go, this is what's going on, and this is what we saw, and here are my pictures, and here is the story of, you know, Muhammad and his family, and yet that helps. But just physically having us there, I don't think they care. I mean, they shoot journalists. It just doesn't seem like that would make a difference. Okay. Anything else? It's my granddaughter, not my grandson. Just, you know, but that's okay.
Do you think that it really is sad? It's not just the rise of fascism, it's also the rise of religious extremism.
Right, right. And
Christian, Jewish, Muslim,
right,
all of them.
right. And, you know, some of this may be a response to the fact that a more liberal society was rising, women were rising, people of color were rising. You know, there was a sort of, we thought, oh, we're going to just get more and more enlightened and have more opportunity. And this is the pushback. So you could look at it as, you know, this is the response to a little bit of success from the other side, which just means that we have to keep working harder.
Except that it seems like throughout all history, it's been like this, that it's an aspect of human nature, not any one group. And that democracy, socialism, individual rights, rather than a hierarchical society, is something that is not the usual way.
Yeah, I
thoughts?
mean, I can't get up in the morning if I think that this is human nature. I can certainly see from history that people tend to live in, patriarchal oppressive systems a lot, and that the people who are oppressed are constantly struggling to get more power. And that's, the arc of history. I have to believe that we just have to keep doing it because the alternative seems too terrible. And
Yeah, like we have to keep fighting for
right,
against
Yeah.
the climate crisis,
right.
even though it's too
you know,
late and it's hopeless.
It's not too late. It is pretty hopeless, but it's not too late. But just think about my life as a woman, being able to get an education, being a doctor, having a family, this wasn't open to women 100 years ago. So it's not like everything is terrible. I mean, we're the privileged white people here, so we should appreciate our privilege, but it's not like everything is terrible, but there are a lot of terrible things. And I think we have to not lose heart. And we have to also remember the people who are suffering. I mean, whenever I think like, how can I do this one more minute? I think about all my friends that I have in Gaza. So when Israel bombs Gaza, I'm typing emails to all these people and going on Signal. Are you okay? Is your family okay? Because I physically know people who are under threat, and it's intolerable to just hope that they're better. So, you have to make it, there's something, I always say I'd rather be loud than silent because, I feel better that way. So you have to pick your way to do things, but I don't think it's human nature. You could say it's human nature to be nurturing, mothering, and kind.
And I do.
So
Both.
there's a lot of human natures here. We have to work on toxic masculinity, I think.
We go back a couple thousand years,
Right,
much less of it.
Right.
The hunter-gatherer societies.
Right. Okay. So I think we've been doing this for a long time. So
Well, thank you very much to Alice for
I hope it was
sharing
helpful.
your experience and your wisdom with us. It's been very interesting. And we'll certainly look for your book. And how could you
Don't
say
look
you
for
write?
it, order it. Ask for
Order
your
it.
library to
Well,
order it.
I'm thinking about giving it to the library here. Would
Right.
be a good
Yeah,
idea.
it can be ordered, from a bookstore, on Amazon, off my website. You have to be active. It's not going to fall in your lap.
Okay.
You're not
And
going to
what
see it on some display.
What about your essay? Will that be published somewhere?
So
or-
I have an essay that I'm just finishing that's going to come out in The Link, which is a web magazine of progressive thought about where is Palestine in children's literature, and sort of a whole analysis of this. And then I'm also working on this research project about sort of helping teachers to deal with the accusation of anti-Semitism, and what do you do and what are your resources. We're not sure where we're going to publish that, and that's a much more it's a lengthy process because we interviewed teachers and we interviewed lawyers and we put all this stuff together. So I'm not sure where that's going to be published, but it should be published in the next probably 2 months, as will the Link article. So I'll be sending out the Link article on my MailChimp. If people sign up for my MailChimp, you can get the Link article.
Wonderful.
Thank you. This was really inspiring.
Oh, good. We have to help each other and uplift each other.
Thanks again.
Otherwise, I sink into despair.
Yes. Okay, take care.
Best of luck to you.
Thank you. I'm going to sign off now.
Thank you very much, Alice.